Arthur gripped the handle of the mop, its worn wood a familiar grounding presence in his calloused palm. The water in the bucket sloshed, a murky gray tide that mirrored the last decade of his life. It was 3 in the morning, the hour of ghosts, and the Vance Tower was his cathedral of solitude. He moved through the cavernous lobby, his squeaking cart the only sound breaking the tomb-like silence of polished marble and cold steel. Each swipe of the mop was a penance, a rhythm he had perfected over 10 years. Swipe, rinse, ring. A simple, honest cycle that demanded nothing of him but the effort of his body, leaving his mind free to drift in the wreckage of his past. Tonight, the 55th floor was his final destination. The executive floor, the nest of vipers. He could feel the change in the air as the elevator ascended, the pressure in his ears, a faint echo of the pressure that had once crushed his soul. The doors opened onto a plush carpet that absorbed the sound of his cart's wheels, a stark contrast to the echoing marble below. Here, the air was different, filtered, sterile, smelling faintly of expensive leather and ambition. He pushed his cart past a series of darkened glass-walled offices, names etched in silver on the doors. Names he knew, names he loathed. At the end of the hall was the boardroom, the heart of the beast. Light spilled from beneath the grand double doors. They were working late. A big deal, he'd heard the whispers among the daytime staff. A merger that would make them all titans. He paused, his hand resting on the cool brass handle. He could hear the murmur of voices, the clink of glasses, the self-congratulatory laughter. For a moment, the old Julian Vance, the man who had designed this very room, wanted to turn back. The man known only as Arthur, the janitor, knew he could not. He took a deep breath that tasted of bleach and regret, and pushed the door open. The laughter died instantly. 20 pairs of eyes, sharp and predatory in expensive suits, swiveled to face him. They looked at him not as a man, but as an interruption, an inconvenience. A smudge on their perfect panoramic view of the city lights. In the center of the long mahogany table, Richard Sterling, the CEO, lowered his crystal tumbler of whiskey. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his smile a predatory slash of white. He was the man who had once called Julian brother, the man who had stood beside him at his wedding, and the man who had buried him. "What is it?" Richard's voice was smooth, but laced with an irritation as sharp as broken glass. He didn't recognize him. Of course he didn't. 10 years of grief, poverty, and anonymity had weathered Julian's face, grayed his hair, and stooped his shoulders. He was a ghost. "Sorry, Mr. Sterling," Arthur mumbled, keeping his eyes downcast. "Just finishing my rounds." A younger executive, a man named Davies with a cruel mouth, snickered. "Rounds? It's the middle of the night. Can't the dust wait until morning, Pops?" The word "Pops" struck a nerve. Julian felt a tremor in his hand. He tightened his grip on the cart. He had envisioned this moment 1,000 times, played it over and over in the lonely silence of his small apartment. But the reality of it, the raw, casual contempt, was more potent than he had ever imagined. "The floor needs cleaning," Arthur said, his voice raspy. He began to push his cart towards the far side of the room, intending to be as unobtrusive as possible. His plan had a specific timing, and this wasn't it. Not yet. "Hold on," Richard said, a flicker of something, amusement perhaps, in his cold eyes. He stood up, circling the table like a shark. "You know, gentlemen, this is a perfect example of what we're celebrating tonight. Drive, ambition, the will to succeed." He gestured vaguely at Arthur. "And then there's the alternative, a life spent on your knees, cleaning up another man's mess." A wave of sycophantic chuckles rippled through the room. They were a pack, and their leader had chosen the night's entertainment. Davies leaned back in his chair, beaming. "He's probably got a whole life philosophy. Tell us, old man, what's the secret to happiness? A clean floor and an empty mind?" Julian stopped. He slowly turned his head, his gaze lifting from the floor for the first time. He let his eyes sweep across their faces. Smug, arrogant, utterly blind. They saw a uniform, not a man. They saw failure. Not a soul forged in a fire they couldn't even comprehend. His gaze finally settled on Richard. For a breathtaking second, he saw a flicker of recognition in Richard's eyes, a ghost of a memory, before it was snuffed out by disbelief. It couldn't be. Julian Vance was dead. a bankrupt, broken man who had vanished a decade ago. My mind is not empty, Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying a new weight that made the room fall silent. It's quite full, actually. Richard raised an eyebrow. Oh? Full of what? Regrets? Memories, Arthur corrected softly. For instance, I remember the man who designed this table. He specified that the grain of the mahogany should run in a single, unbroken line, symbolizing unity and a straight path forward. He ran a finger along the polished surface. I also remember the man who designed this building. He angled this very window so that at the winter solstice the morning sun would strike the exact center of the room, a symbol of new beginnings. A tense quiet settled over the boardroom. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the simple-minded janitor they had assumed. This was something else. Davies, ever the sycophant, tried to break the tension with a forced laugh. Wow, quite the architectural historian. You picked that up from the Discovery Channel. Arthur ignored him. His eyes were locked on Richard, who had not moved, his face a mask of stone. I remember a promise made in a dorm room over cheap beer between two young men who were going to build things that mattered. Things that would last. Richard's jaw tightened. The blood had drained from his face. Who are you? He whispered. The question a ragged edge of sound. Arthur allowed a small, sad smile to touch his lips. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn janitor's jacket. The men tensed, a primal fear of the unknown flashing in their eyes. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a single folded document. It was crisp and new, a stark contrast to his stained uniform. He placed it gently on the table, in the exact center where the solstice sun would strike. He unfolded it with deliberate, almost reverent care. My name is Arthur. That's the name I use to clean your floors, he said, his voice gaining strength, the rasp of disuse burning away to reveal the clear, resonant tone of the man he used to be. But the name on that document is Julian Vance. Richard staggered back as if struck, his hand flying to his chest. The name hung in the air, an impossible specter. The other men stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. That document, Julian continued, his voice now ringing with an authority that had been dormant for 10 years, is the deed to this building. All of it. From the foundation to the spire. I purchased the holding company that owned it last month. Through a series of shell corporations it took me 8 years to build. He looked around the room, meeting the gaze of each man, one by one. Their arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a stark, chilling fear. You are celebrating a merger tonight. A new chapter for Sterling Vance Enterprises, a company built on a stolen dream. But you've overlooked a small detail in your contract. A standard clause, I believe. He tapped the deed. Your lease on this entire building is contingent on the goodwill of the property owner. And as of this moment, he looked directly at Richard, the pain of a decade of betrayal hardening his eyes into chips of ice. You have lost it. He let the words sink in. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant siren of a city that never slept. Your lease is terminated. Effective immediately. You have 30 days to vacate the premises, all of you. He gestured to the papers and champagne flutes littering the table. Enjoy the rest of your party, gentlemen. When you're finished, I'd appreciate it if you'd clean up your own mess. He turned, leaving the deed on the table, a silent testament to his impossible return. He walked out of the boardroom not as Arthur the janitor, but as Julian Vance, the ghost who had come back to reclaim his kingdom. The click of the closing door sounded like a death knell. He walked down the silent, carpeted hall, his cart squeaking softly behind him. The cool satisfaction he had expected to feel was absent. In its place was a profound, aching emptiness. He had won. He had destroyed the man who had destroyed him. So why did it feel like he had just lost all over again? The following days were a blur of legal chaos. Richard Sterling's attorneys swarmed, but the paperwork was ironclad. Julian's had spent years meticulously planning this, using the small fortune his wife, Eleanor, had inherited and hidden from Richard, growing it piece by piece in the shadows of the market. He had become a financial ghost, his every move untraceable until the final decisive strike. The news broke like a thunderclap across the financial world. Sterling Vance Enterprises, a pillar of the industry, was being evicted from its own iconic headquarters by a mystery owner. The media frenzy was intense, but Julian remained in the shadows. He had no interest in fame, only in the quiet, complete dismantling of Richard's empire. He continued his job as a janitor, a decision that baffled his own lawyer. Mr. Zance, you're one of the wealthiest in the city now. You don't have to do this. It's the only thing that makes sense, Julian had replied. The routine was his anchor, the anonymity, his shield. In the fluorescent lit halls of the Vance Tower, he was just Arthur. It was a penance and a reminder. He watched the panicked exodus from a distance, observing the movers hauling away expensive furniture, the defeated slump of the executives as they carried their boxes to their cars. He saw Davies arguing with a security guard, his face flushed with impotent rage. He felt nothing. The fire of his revenge had burned out, leaving behind only cold ash. It was during the final week of the eviction that his world tilted on its axis again. He was cleaning the deserted cubicles on the 34th floor, a sea of gray fabric and empty desks. Most of the personal effects were gone, but one cubicle remained untouched. Taped to the monitor was a child's drawing of a smiling sun, rendered in bright, hopeful crayon. Pinned to the cubicle wall was a photo of a woman with warm, tired eyes, hugging a little girl with a gap-toothed grin. As he reached to wipe down the desk, the woman from the photograph appeared in the doorway. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped. It was Clara, a junior analyst he'd sometimes seen working late. She had always been one of the few who acknowledged him, offering a quiet, "Good evening, Arthur," or a small weary smile. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't think anyone would be up here. Just finishing up." Julian mumbled, keeping his head down. He felt an unfamiliar pang of something, guilt. She was one of the hundreds of employees. Collateral damage in his war against one man. She walked over to the desk and began carefully taking down the drawing and the photo. I couldn't face it yesterday, packing up Lily's artwork." She looked at the drawing, her expression a mixture of love and pain. "She was so proud of this. She said it was to make sure my office was never sad." Her voice cracked on the last word. Julian stopped working. He stood there, mop in hand, a silent witness to a sorrow he had directly caused. He had imagined Richard's ruin, Davies's humiliation. He had never once pictured this quiet, personal grief. "I'm sorry you lost your job," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. Clara looked up at him, her eyes glistening. She offered a fragile smile. "It's not your fault, Arthur. It's this crazy new owner. Some ghost who bought the building just to destroy the company. They say he's a monster. A monster." The word landed like a physical blow. He had thought of himself as an instrument of justice, an avenging angel. But to her, to the hundreds like her, he was just a destructive, faceless force. She packed her few belongings into a small cardboard box. As she turned to leave, she paused and looked at him. "You've always been kind, Arthur. A quiet presence in this madhouse. I hope you get to keep your job." And then she was gone, leaving Julian alone in the echoing silence of the empty office floor. Her words haunted him. He looked at the empty space where the child's drawing of the sun had been. He had plunged all these lives into darkness. And for what? A victory that tasted like ashes. His revenge was complete, but his soul was more barren than ever. For the first time in a decade, he felt a flicker of a new, terrifying emotion, doubt. He had set out to right a wrong, but in the process, he had become the very thing he despised. A rich, powerful man who ruined lives without a second thought. That night, Julian didn't go back to his Spartan apartment. He went to the penthouse, the one he had designed for himself and Eleanor all those years ago. It had sat empty for a decade, a preserved monument to a life that had never been. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the moonlight, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The furniture was still covered in white sheets, like sleeping giants. He walked through the silent rooms, the ghosts of his past swirling around him. He could almost hear Eleanor's laughter, see her dancing in the empty living room, her face full of dreams for their future. The pain of her loss, a dull ache he had carried for 10 years, sharpened into a fresh, unbearable agony. She had died 6 months after Richard's betrayal. The doctors called it a sudden aneurysm, but Julian knew the truth. She had died of a broken heart, shattered by the loss of their dream and the treachery of their closest friend. His revenge was for her. It was all for her. "Did I do the right thing, Ellie?" he whispered into the darkness. "Did I make him pay?" The silence was his only answer. He sank onto a sheet-covered sofa, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had torn down the monument to Richard's greed, but what was he going to build in its place? He was the king of an empty castle, haunted by the memory of his lost queen and the faces of the innocent people he had harmed, the face of Clara, the face of her daughter, Lily. He had their box of belongings delivered to their home address, a detail he procured from HR files before they were shredded. Inside, he tucked an envelope containing $10,000 in cash, an anonymous act of penance, a drop of water in a desert of his own making. A week later, he was in a small diner near his apartment, nursing a cup of coffee when the bell over the door jingled. He glanced up and saw Clara walk in, holding the hand of a little girl with bright, curious eyes and a familiar gap-toothed smile. It was Lily. His heart seized. He quickly looked down at his newspaper, hiding his face. They sat in a booth a few feet away. He could hear their conversation, the musical lilt of Lily's voice and the gentle, patient murmur of her mother's. "Mommy, can I have pancakes with chocolate chips?" Lily asked. "Of course, sweetie. It's a celebration," Clara said, her voice warmer, lighter than he had ever heard it. A celebration of what? A celebration of new beginnings and of kindness. Someone sent us a gift, a very generous gift. It's going to help us until Mommy finds a new job. Julian's hand trembled, sloshing coffee onto the table. He hadn't expected to see the result of his anonymous gesture. He certainly hadn't expected it to feel like this, a small, fragile spark of warmth in the frozen landscape of his heart. "Was it a secret angel?" Lily asked, her eyes wide. Clara smiled, a genuine, beautiful smile that reached her eyes. "Maybe it was, honey. Maybe it was." He listened as they ate, as Lily chattered about her school and her friends, as Clara laughed. It was a small, perfect moment of happiness, and he was an outsider looking in. He was the secret angel, but he was also the monster who had created the need for one. The contradiction tore at him. He stood up, leaving a few dollars on the table, and walked out of the diner, the sound of Lily's laughter following him like a judgment. He couldn't be both. He had to choose. The choice led him to do something he hadn't done in 10 years. He went to a barber shop and had his straggly hair cut and his beard shaved. He bought a new suit, a simple, dark gray one that felt foreign on his skin. He looked at his reflection in the store window and saw a stranger looking back, a man caught somewhere, between Julian Vance and Arthur the janitor. He didn't know who this man was supposed to be. He found out where Clara lived from the same employee file. It felt like a violation, but he was driven by a compulsion he didn't understand. He went to her apartment building, a modest walk-up in a quiet neighborhood, and stood across the street watching. He saw her come home with Lily, carrying a bag of groceries. He saw them through their window reading a book together on the sofa. It was a real life, full of small moments of love and connection. Everything he had lost, everything he had forgotten existed. He started leaving more anonymous gifts. A gift certificate to a toy store in their mailbox, an order of groceries delivered to their door. Each time he would watch from a distance, feeding on the small moments of their joy like a starving man. It was a strange, pathetic existence, being a phantom benefactor. He knew it couldn't last. One afternoon, as he was watching from his usual spot, Lily came out of the building to play on the small patch of grass in front. She was chasing a butterfly when she tripped and fell, scraping her knee. She let out a cry of pain. Clara came running out, but Julian was already moving. He didn't think, he just reacted. He crossed the street in seconds, kneeling beside the crying child. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lily looked up at him, her face tear-streaked. Her eyes widened in recognition. "You're the man from the diner," she said between sobs. Clara reached them, her face a mask of concern that quickly shifted to surprise as she saw him. "Arthur?" she said, confused. "What are you doing here?" I was just passing by," he lied. his heart pounding. He felt like an exposed nerve. He gently examined Lily's knee. "It's just a scrape. You're very brave." Lily sniffled, looking at him with a child's unfiltered curiosity. "Are you our secret angel?" The question hung in the air, impossibly direct. Julian's throat went dry. He looked at Clara, whose expression was now a mixture of suspicion and dawning realization. She was putting the pieces together. The man from her old office, the man from the diner, the man who just happened to be here. She looked at his new clothes, his clean-shaven face. She was seeing him for the first time. "It was you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The money, the groceries. Why?" Julian stood up, feeling intensely vulnerable. The wall he had built around himself for a decade was crumbling. I felt responsible," he said, the admission costing him more than he could have imagined. "What happened at the company? It wasn't fair to people like you." Clara stared at him, her brow furrowed in thought. "But you're a janitor. How could you?" Her voice trailed off as a new, more incredible possibility began to form in her mind. She looked at him, truly looked at him, at the intelligence in his eyes, the quiet authority in his posture that his janitor's uniform had hidden so well. "My name isn't Arthur," he said softly, the lie finally falling away. "It's Julian Vance." He watched the color drain from her face. He saw the shock, the disbelief, and then the dawning horror and betrayal. He was the monster. He was the ghost who had destroyed her life, and he had been standing here pretending to be her savior. "You," she breathed, taking a step back, pulling Lily behind her as if to shield her from him. "It was you. You're the one who did all this." The warmth in her eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. "You destroyed everything, and then you sent us money? Was that supposed to make you feel better? Was it some kind of sick game for you?" "No," he said desperately. "It wasn't like that. It's complicated." "Complicated?" she shot back, her voice rising. "It seems pretty simple to me. A rich man decided to play God, and hundreds of people lost their jobs. My friends lost their jobs. I lost my job. And you show up here playing the part of the Good Samaritan? Stay away from us. Stay away from my daughter." She scooped Lily into her arms and carried her back into the building, slamming the door behind them. The sound echoed in the quiet street. Julian stood alone on the sidewalk, the raw pain of her rejection a physical blow. She was right. He had tried to wash away his sins with money, to buy a clear conscience. But he couldn't. The damage was done. He had finally stepped out of the shadows, and the light had revealed him for what he was. A monster. The realization was more devastating than Richard's betrayal, more painful than a decade of lonely grief. He had thought he had nothing left to lose, but he was wrong. He had just lost the fragile hope of a new beginning he hadn't even realized he was building. For 2 weeks, Julian descended back into a darkness deeper than any he had known before. He didn't go to the tower. He let his lawyers handle the final stages of the corporate eviction. He stayed in his small apartment, the curtains drawn, the silence a suffocating blanket. The ghost of Julian Vance had been exorcised from the world once, and the ghost of Arthur the janitor had been banished as well. He was nobody, adrift in a sea of his own making. He thought of Clara's face, the flash of betrayal in her eyes. He thought of Lily, and the way she had called him a secret angel. The juxtaposition was a form of torture. He replayed every decision, every move he had made. The intricate, patient revenge that had been his life's sole focus now seemed like a hollow, pointless exercise in destruction. He had vanquished his enemy, but in doing so, he had become him. A man who wielded power without regard for the consequences, who moved lives around like pieces on a chessboard. His lawyer called him daily, with updates he didn't listen to. Richard Sterling was ruined. His assets were frozen pending an investigation into the fraud Julian had anonymously exposed. His reputation was shattered. The news should have brought Julian a grim satisfaction. Instead, he felt nothing but a profound weariness. The fight was over, and he was left with the bitter spoils of war, wealth he didn't want, and a solitude he could no longer bear. One evening, unable to stand the confines of his apartment, he walked. He had no destination, but his feet carried him on a familiar path back towards the Vance Tower. He stood across the street, Looking up at its darkened silhouette against the twilight sky, it was his, a monument to his victory, a tombstone for his soul. As he stood there, a black car pulled up to the curb a few yards away. The back door opened and Richard Sterling got out. He looked smaller, diminished. His perfect suit was rumpled, his face gaunt and unshaven. He stared up at the building with a look of pure, undiluted hatred. Then his eyes scanned the street and found Julian. Richard walked towards him, his steps unsteady. There was no security detail, no entourage, just a broken man. "Vance," he rasped, his voice raw. "I should have known you were too stubborn to just die." Julian said nothing. He simply watched the man who had been his brother devolve into this pathetic creature. "You took everything," Richard hissed, his hands clenched into fists. "Everything I built. You built it on a foundation of lies," Julian said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You stole my designs, you stole my company, and you stole my life. You left me with nothing. I gave you an opportunity." Richard's voice rose to a desperate shout. "You were the dreamer, the artist. I was the one who made it real. I made us millions. But it was never enough for you. You and your damned principles." "Our principles," Julian corrected him quietly. "The ones we agreed on. We were supposed to build affordable, sustainable housing, not luxury prisons for the wealthy. We were supposed to build communities, not monuments to greed. And Eleanor, she was always on your side." Richard sneered, his face twisting with a venom that had festered for years. "Whispering in your ear, holding you back. If it wasn't for her, you would have seen things my way." A cold rage, something Julian hadn't felt since that night in the boardroom, coiled in his stomach. "Don't you dare speak her name?" "Why not?" Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's the reason for all this, isn't she? Your sainted Eleanor. You think I don't know why she really died? It wasn't a broken heart, you sentimental fool. It was the pressure, the shame of being married to a failure. I was free of you, and she couldn't stand it. She couldn't stand that I had won." The world went red at the edges. Julian lunged forward, his hands closing around the front of Richard's expensive coat. He slammed him against the cold granite wall of the building, the impact echoing in the quiet street. For a second, he saw himself ending it right here with his bare hands. The savage, primal urge to destroy was overwhelming. But then, through the red haze of his anger, he saw Clara's face. He heard her voice calling him a monster. He saw Lily's wide, innocent eyes. Was this who he wanted to be? A man ruled by violence and vengeance? Was this the legacy he wanted to leave? With a shuddering breath, he released Richard, pushing him away. Richard stumbled back, gasping, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You're not worth it," Julian said, his voice trembling with the effort of his control. "You're nothing, a hollow man in an empty suit. You've already lost." He turned and walked away, leaving Richard leaning against the wall of the tower they had built together, a king deposed from his stolen throne. Julian walked and walked, the anger slowly draining away, leaving him feeling scoured, empty, but strangely. He had faced his demon, the embodiment of his past, and he had chosen not to become him. It wasn't a victory, but it was a choice, and for the first time, it felt like his own. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't about anonymous gifts or grand gestures. It was about truth. He went back to Clara's apartment building, but this time he didn't hide across the street. He walked up the steps and buzzed her apartment. There was a long silence. He was about to turn away when the intercom crackled to life. "What do you want?" Her voice was cold, guarded. "I need to talk to you," please, not to apologize, not to explain, just to tell you the truth, all of it. After that, I'll walk away and you'll never see me again. I promise." Another long pause. He could hear her breathing on the other end. Finally, the buzzer sounded, unlocking the door. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. She was waiting at her open door, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She let him in without a word. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the scent of cinnamon and the cheerful clutter of a child's life. Lily was asleep in a small bedroom off the main living area, the door slightly ajar. "You have 5 minutes," Clara said, her voice low so as not to wake her daughter. Julian didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of her living room, feeling like an intruder in this small sanctuary of warmth and love. And he told her everything. He told her about Richard, about their dream, about the betrayal. He told her about Eleanor, about her death, about the decade of grief and darkness that followed. He told her about the long, slow plan for revenge, about living as Arthur, about the emptiness he felt after his victory. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just laid the broken pieces of his life out before her. I didn't see you, he finished, his voice raw with emotion. I didn't see any of the people who worked in that building. I only saw him. I was so consumed by my own pain that I couldn't see the pain I was causing. When you called me a monster, you were right. I had become one. Clara listened, her expression slowly softening as he spoke. The hard anger in her eyes was replaced by a deep, compassionate sadness. She saw the profound, lonely pain in this man who had lost everything, tried to reclaim it through vengeance, and found himself more lost than ever. My husband, she said softly when he was finished, died 2 years ago. A construction accident. One day he was there, and the next, he was gone. For a year I was so angry at the company, at the world, at God. I wanted someone to blame, someone to punish. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't think you're a monster, Julian. I think you're a man who was drowning, and you tried to pull your enemy under with you, without realizing you were in a crowded pool. Her understanding was a balm on his wounded soul. It was more than he deserved. I am so sorry, Clara, for everything. I know, she whispered. A small voice came from the bedroom. Mommy? Clara's focus shifted instantly. I'm here, sweetie. Go back to sleep. She turned back to Julian. I think you should go now. It was a dismissal, but it wasn't harsh. It was practical. It was necessary. He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Thank you for listening. He walked to the door, feeling a strange sense of peace. He had told the truth. He had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a decade. It was enough. As he reached for the doorknob, Lily appeared in the bedroom doorway, rubbing her eyes, a small teddy bear clutched in her hand. She looked at Julian, her expression sleepy and confused. Secret angel, she mumbled. Are you leaving? Julian's heart ached. He knelt down to her level. I have to, little one. She patted over to him and, to his astonishment, wrapped her small arms round his neck in a hug. Please don't go, she whispered into his ear. Mommy's sad when you're not here. Julian froze, his arms hovering, unsure what to do. He looked over Lily's head at Clara, whose face was a storm of conflicting emotions. He could see the fear, the hesitation, but underneath it all, he saw a flicker of something else, a flicker of hope. Clara walked over and gently touched her daughter's back. Lily, honey, it's late. But he can stay for breakfast, Lily insisted, her voice firm with a child's simple logic. We're having pancakes. Julian looked at Clara, his eyes asking a silent question. He was giving her the choice. He would accept whatever she decided. He would walk away and build a new life alone, or he would stay for pancakes. Clara looked from her daughter's hopeful face to Julian's vulnerable one. She saw the broken man who had confessed his soul to her. She saw the kind man who had tried clumsily to help her. And she saw the possibility of a future she had thought was no longer possible for her. A future with kindness, with companionship, with a man who understood loss as deeply as she did. A slow smile touched her lips. The batter is already made, she said softly. It would be a shame to waste it. It was a simple sentence, but it was everything. It was forgiveness. It was an invitation. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one not built on revenge or sorrow, but on the quiet, hopeful promise of chocolate chip pancakes. Julian felt a tear slide down his cheek, the first he had shed not of grief but of gratitude. He gently hugged Lily back, the small, warm weight of the child in his arms feeling more real and more valuable than the cold, empty tower that bore his name. 6 months later, the Vance Tower was no longer a monument to corporate greed. Julian had transformed it. The top 10 floors became the headquarters for the new Vance Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding sustainable urban development and providing legal aid to those wronged by corporate malfeasance. The rest of the building was converted into mixed-income housing, with several floors dedicated to subsidized apartments for families. He had hired Clara, with her sharp mind and compassionate heart, to run the Foundation's community outreach program. They worked together, their professional relationship slowly, carefully blossoming into a personal one. They built their connection on a foundation of honesty, sharing their stories of grief and finding a common strength. Julian found a purpose not in tearing down, but in building up. He was using his wealth and his skills not for himself, but for others. He was finally building the things he and Eleanor had dreamed of. One crisp autumn afternoon, Julian, Clara, and Lily stood in a park across the river, looking at the city skyline. The Vance Tower stood tall, its glass catching the golden light of the setting sun. It was no longer a symbol of betrayal or a tombstone for his past. It was a beacon of his future. "It's beautiful," Clara said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It's just a building," Julian replied, his arm wrapped around her. He had learned that true foundations were not made of steel and concrete, but of trust and love. Lily, holding his other hand, pointed up at the tower. "That's your building, Julian," she said matter-of-factly. He smiled down at her, his heart full. "No," he said, squeezing her hand and then Clara's. This is my building." He was no longer Julian Vance, the vengeful ghost, nor Arthur, the invisible janitor. He was just Julian, a man who had walked through the darkest valleys of grief and rage and had been led back into the light by the simple, unwavering kindness of a woman and her child. He had found that the greatest revenge against a world that had tried to break him was not to destroy but to heal, and in healing others he had finally miraculously healed himself. The city's lights began to twinkle on, but for the first time in a long, long time, they couldn't compare to the light that was shining from within.